Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, OSHA Updates, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Deb Beto, and I will be your moderator today and be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the website currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. All of the webinar, well, if you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. We do not control the audio. Your devices control the audio. So if you have audio difficulties, try adjusting the volume settings on your device. If a telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Please feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for those options to appear in your options bar, and then you can select the appropriate option. We will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation today, and if we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. And you may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenter will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have a number of webinars upcoming covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory preventing harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's OSHA update presentation. Our presenter today is Erica Baird. Erica Baird is a safety, health, and risk management consultant with more than 15 years of experience in the insurance industry. She has presented on numerous safety topics, including ergonomics, hazard communication, heat illness prevention, and supervisor responsibilities. She has earned a number of designations in insurance and safety, including CPCU and ARM, and is pleased to have joined the Aspen family as a senior risk and safety consultant. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you, Deb. Welcome to Heffernan's annual OSHA update. Thank you for joining us, everybody. The purpose of today's presentation is to share updates related to OSHA regulations, to provide some insight into how these regulations came about, and to talk about how they apply for different companies. We do have to start with a disclaimer. I need to point out the disclaimer, which clarifies that information provided here is general information, and that it's a presentation that doesn't constitute any kind of consulting or advice or client relationship between the presenter and the attendees. And this is our agenda. So we're going to start with a review of national injury statistics, just to gain some insight into where OSHA directs their focus for inspections and how regulatory changes come about. We'll also talk on COVID-19, but we're not going to do a deep dive into the specific requirements of this emergency standard or how to apply them to different workplaces. We're just looking at it as an overview. We're also going to cover some other newer regulations like wildfire, smoke, heat illness prevention for indoor places of employment, lighting requirements for ag when working in the dark, and we'll talk about valley fever. At the end of the presentation, there are a number of links with supporting information, and they're all going to be shared with you, so you'll have access to all of that information. The data that you're looking at on the screen here, it's always based, there's a delay. So we're looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2019, and that delay is based on data for fatal and non-fatal workplace incidents, and it allows for some time for data collection and statistical review. So next year, we'll actually talk about 2020 lost data, and how that was impacted by the pandemic and business closures. The reason why this review is included in the presentation on OSHA updates is because this is how OSHA determines how they're going to direct their resources each year. So if we can understand the items flagged by the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it'll help us predict what OSHA might focus on. And it also give you some direction for changes and improvements you might want to make in your safety program. So in 2019, there were 5,333 fatal occupational injuries, and that's the largest number of occupational fatalities since 2007. The fatal work injury rate across all industries was 3.5 fatalities per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers, and that's the equivalent of a worker dying every 99 minutes. Hispanic and Latino worker fatalities increased 13% to 1,088, which is it accounts for 20% of the fatal occupational injuries for the year. In 1992, they only made up 9%, so that's a huge increase. Both the construction industry and drivers also saw increases. Fatalities in private construction were up 5% to 1,061 fatalities, and that again is the largest number since 2007. There were 1,005 fatal occupational injuries for drivers, sales workers, and truck drivers, and that's the highest since 2003. So a bunch of jumps there. In 2019, 38% of all workplace fatalities occurred in workers aged 55 and over. In 1992, that group made up only 20%. So that's an increase even over last year of 8%. 54% of total fatalities occurred in workers between the ages of 25 and 54, while workers under age 24 only made up 8%. And that brings us to our first poll question.
Okay, so here we go. Do you have employees who drive a vehicle for business purposes? So while you are answering that polling question, I'm just going to let you know that I like to wait to see that we have about 80% of the people engaged in answering the polling question. And I'm assuming maybe the other 20% are sharing a computer. So I want to see a good engagement from everybody. So you guys are doing great so far. So Erica, we have 84% say yes and 16% say no.
Okay, wow, that's a big group, 84%. All right. So the reason we get into that is because we're still focusing on those transportation incidents. Any employee who drives for a business, even if they're picking up a lunch order for an executive or they're going between job sites, or even those sales workers that we've already talked about, they pose a liability for your company. So it doesn't matter if they're driving their own car or if they drive a tractor trailer. If they're in an accident and they can be seriously injured, and that's going to affect workers' comp, they're going to show up in these statistics. And what we're bringing up here is just a look at fatal work injuries associated with different events and exposures from 2016 through 2019. And you can see that over the last 4 years, there haven't been a lot of changes in transportation incidents, primarily made up of motor vehicle accidents, account for more than twice as many fatal injuries as any of the other categories listed. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicated that close to 1 in 5, or 20%, of fatally injured workers were drivers, sales workers, or truck drivers. So it's a major exposure that companies really need to pay attention to. This slide is for 2019, so it's the exact same data, but just for 2019, which is our most recent data. In that year, there were 2,122 fatal transportation incidents. As an exposure, this really requires some focus from companies who have drivers. So 84% of you guys are dealing with this kind of exposure. It's important that everybody who drives for a company has their license and that you verify it and that they have an acceptable driving record. And if they're using their own car, making sure that they have insurance is really important as well. So just like you have an injury and illness prevention plan with a code of safe practices that sets expectations for safety in the workplace, you want to also set expectations that apply to operating motor vehicles. Sometimes we look at driving as something that everybody does every day, and we don't pay as much attention to it as an exposure in the workplace. But when a person represents a company as their driver, they really need to be meeting the company's standards, and they have to be trained on what those expectations are as well. In 2019, there were 888,220 non-fatal injuries and illnesses that resulted in at least one missed day of work. The median number of days away from work in private industry was 8 days, so more than a week. And for workers aged 65 and older, the median days away from work was 16, or twice as long as other private industry workers. And that's just because there's a lot more recovery time required for people as they mature. The incident rate for total recordable cases was 2.8 per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers, and that's the same for the last couple of years. According to the National Safety Council, there were 70 million days lost due to injuries that occurred in 2019. And over the next couple of years, we're going to see another 55 million days lost from those same injuries. So all those injuries really add up to a lot of missed time at work. This table shows the 10 industries with the most days away from work, restricted work, or transfers. And it's calculated per 10,000 full-time equivalent workers. These 10 occupations make up 33.2% of all of private industry with days away from work, and compares 2018 to 2019. You can actually see that in 2019, there was an increase pretty much across the board here. Nursing assistants are at the top of the list, and then there's those heavy tractor trailer truck drivers right behind them. In fact, if you look at the top 10, you've got nurses in there twice, drivers in there twice, construction is in there, maintenance, repair, and retail sales are all in there. And these industries, you're going to see them as recurring themes as we go on. Okay, Deb, we have another poll question.
All right, I will launch our next polling question. And what is the second leading cause of death for women in the workplace? While you're answering that question, I just need to let you know that just as all of the uncontrolled situations that we have from working in our home offices, I have a work crew outside my window today. So I apologize if there is excessive noise out there. It's something I can't control. All right, we have about 50% of the people that have voted. Again, I like to see that we have some really good participation, so I'm going to wait here, and I think that you are probably contemplating your choices here because you are being very thoughtful. So we'll wait just another second while you have time to do that. And Erica, we have 60% say slip, trip, falls, 20% say homicide, 14% say material handling, and the rest, minority percent, say forklift accidents.
Okay, so here we have a table that shows you leading causes of death by gender from 2019. And you can see that the second leading cause of death for women in the workplace is homicide. That's more than twice as likely as men, as women are more than twice as likely as men to be murdered in the workplace. And typically these homicides are due to domestic violence or sometimes a coworker. Most of these injuries are shooting. So it's something to be aware of. Workplace violence is something we're talking about a lot right now. So I wanted to point that out. For men, the second leading cause is actually slip, trips, and falls, which I think was the top choice in the poll. When broken down, the vast majority of those falls are falls to lower levels, and those often occur on construction sites, which is one of those focuses for industries. Fall prevention has been one of OSHA's focus areas for years, and it will continue to be a focus, especially since we saw that 5% increase in fatalities in 2019. The leading cause of fatalities you can see is roadway incidents, which I keep bringing up because it is something that's preventable, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And men and women are equal here. So that's interesting that it's actually equal. Okay, another poll question.
Okay, our next polling question. My company's, oops, did it come up? No, there we go. My company's fleet safety program has rules in place for driving that prohibit the use of cell phones, prohibit the use of cell phones and hands-free devices, do not address cell phones, or there is no program, so it's not applicable. Let us know what your thoughts are on this one. Hopefully you know what your company's fleet safety program rules are. And just waiting momentarily while we get the rest of the people to vote. So, Miss Erica, we have 58% say prohibit the use of cell phones, 17% prohibit the use of cell phones and hand-free devices, only 2% do not address cell phones, and 23% say there is no program.
Okay. And there might not be a program if you don't have any drivers, but if you do, you definitely want to make sure that you have some rules that apply and address your safety expectations for drivers. So the reason why I bring this up is because of distracted driving, very common topic that we try to point out. It leads to a lot of accidents. So we want to make sure that you know that you can't measure whether a driver is paying attention just based on whether both of their hands are on the wheel. So just ignoring those hands-free devices and focusing on cell phones might not be the best way to consider distracted driving. Because of cognitive dissonance, even if somebody is looking at the road when they're driving, their mind can be focused on something else, which is what happens when you're having that phone conversation. So think about the last time you drove to work and you got there and you realize you don't remember anything about driving there. That's that cognitive dissonance. You're probably thinking about something else. So our minds can multitask, but when it comes to driving, we want to be focused on the road. The National Safety Council reports that a driver is 4 times as likely to crash when they're using a cell phone when they're driving. And it's way better for your employees to just pull over and take that call than it is for them to continue driving. Okay, so we've talked about driving a lot. We've seen that it's a major exposure for injuries and fatalities. I want to look at a few other themes, and then we're going to tie those back into OSHA's areas of focus. So here's a summary of fatal event data. This is again for 2019, and you can see there's some industries that just have greater exposures and they rate consistently high in fatality rates, and those are things like logging, fishing, related fishing workers, aircraft pilots, flight engineers, and even roofers. All of those had fatality rates more than 10 times the all-worker rate of 3.5 fatalities per 100,000 FTE. So based on the data for fatalities, nearly 20% of fatal injuries are those transportation injuries, and that was a 2% increase last year. Slips, trips, and falls jumped 11%. Exposures to harmful substances and environments resulted in 642 deaths. Fatalities among grounds maintenance workers and construction workers and extraction workers all increased as well. And these are areas where every company can do something to protect their employees and train them. So talking about, drivers, providing distracted driver training, making sure they understand the expectations, enforcing fall protection on job sites, making sure that employees are trained to know how to use it properly, making sure walkways are clear of hazards, taking proper precautions to prevent exposures to harmful substances and environments. We can't prevent every injury, but we can do things to make the workplace safer, and that's really important here. All right, so let's talk about top 10 citations. This is another direction for OSHA in areas that they're going to focus. It comes out every year. It usually doesn't change a whole lot, but here's what we're looking at for 2020 for Fed OSHA. Listed in OSHA's top 10 are 4 citations that address falling from heights: fall protection training, scaffolding, and ladders. They've also have hazard communication at number 2, respiratory protection at number 3, and personal and life-saving equipment is also on there. These are all intended to help address those chemical exposures in hazardous environments. OSHA has a couple of regulations that are really unique to the state, and you can see some of those in the top 5 citations here. You have Injury and Illness Prevention Plan, Construction-Specific, IIPP, and Heat Illness Prevention. OSHA doesn't have regulations specific to these, but they'll still cite employers if they see something that's unsafe under the General Duty Clause. You can also see lockout tagout also makes the top 5 in California and is in that top 10 list for OSHA. So there's some common things there. Other things to know about OSHA. Last year, they actually exceeded their inspection goal of 7,540 by over 30 inspections, which is the most out of any state. They cited 18,896 hazards with those visits, and they have been issuing citations for COVID-19 as the Fed OSHA has been as well, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. The next 2 slides we're going to look at identify industry groups and class codes that OSHA has identified as needing further assistance based on their days away from work, restricted, and transfer rates. These include agriculture right at the top with crop farming, ranching, poultry, and egg production, and logging. And remember, logging has that 10 times the national fatality rate. Construction is right on there. There's those roofing contractors, again, 10 times the national fatality rate. Also, manufacturing industry pops up here. A lot of food manufacturing, window, door, cabinet, furnitures, lighting, and foundries. They all get kind of lumped together here. Retail is in here. That stayed level with 2018, but if you were at the presentation last year, you'll know that there was an increase last year in retail, and that is actually focused on those home and garden centers, lawn and garden equipment supply stores, and in grocery stores. And they're also in that top 10 list for days away from work. So they're also flagged in 2 different areas there. Transportation and warehousing. We've talked about motor vehicle accidents a lot already. Healthcare and social assistants are also on this list. And you'll remember nursing assistants were #1 in that top 10 occupations requiring days away from work. And then finally, you see arts and entertainment. That's one specific to golf courses. And that's where those grounds maintenance crews workers work, and they suffered an all-time high number of fatalities in 2019. So it makes sense that they would also have a lot of injuries resulting in days away from work. So overall, this should make sense based on what we've already learned about losses and fatalities. You can see the DART rate for each of these occupations class codes listed here, and you can see the number of establishments and the number of employees that follow under each class code. So it's interesting to look at all that. I want to do a quick review of Cal OSHA just so we understand kind of a little bit about how they work. OSHA and Fed OSHA are very similar here, so it's comparable. OSHA is divided up into different divisions. So you've got the standards board where they develop regulations, and those are eventually signed into law and applied. And then the enforcement unit, their job, everybody dreads having those visits, but their job is to come out and make sure those regulations are followed. The appeals board oversees employer appeals to citations. And then you have OSHA consultation. They provide services that help employers prevent injuries. That's their primary goal. OSHA does have a couple of specialized units. They do things like inspect cranes, pressure vessels, research and development, so things like that. So that's basically OSHA in a nutshell. And then it's important to know what kinds of things might result in a visit from OSHA. So there's 2 types of inspections, programmed and unprogrammed. The unprogrammed inspections are the result of some kind of notification that went to OSHA. So because of some kind of imminent danger that was identified that requires immediate attention, maybe there was a complaint made by an employee or a member of the public, or if there's a serious injury or a fatality, OSHA can also be notified. And I want to point out here that both California and Fed OSHA require that serious injuries and fatalities are reported. In California, you have to report them within 8 hours. And the definitions are a little bit different. California serious injuries are any injury or illness that occurs in a place of employment or in connection with employment and requires inpatient hospitalization for more than medical observation or diagnostic testing, or in which an employee suffers an amputation, loss of an eye, any kind of serious permanent disfigurement. And then it's also in your best interest to just go ahead and report motor vehicle accidents. If you're ever trying to decide if you need to notify OSHA after an injury occurs, it's a lot better to call them and let them decide. They're not going to come out if it doesn't qualify, but a citation for not notifying them is $5,000, and that's before they even start an inspection. So it's in your best interest to call them. Fed OSHA wants to know about fatalities also in 8 hours, but they give you 24 hours to report serious injuries, and they define those as work-related hospitalizations, amputations, or loss of an eye. And then there's also these programmed inspections that include special emphasis programs like those for COVID or for heat. And we've already discussed the high hazard industries, the ones that are identified based on the DART rate. And then finally, targeted inspections. These are usually due to mod rate. You can be targeted if your experience modification rate is 1.25 or higher. The thing to understand about mod is employers with a mod of 1 pay the standard rate in comparison to other companies in their industry. Any employer with a mod that's less than 1 actually has a discounted rate, and that's based on having fewer accidents and injuries in the workplace. And those that are over 1, that 1.25 as an example, they're paying more than average. And then again, that's based on the injuries that they've had in their workplace. So if you get notification by letter that you fall into this group, it's in your best interest to contact OSHA consultation and get assistance. Otherwise, an inspector can just show up to do an inspection. If you work with consultation, when they visit your workplace, they might issue some recommendations that you need to comply with, but they're not going to issue citations, and they're there to help you. So helping you to prevent those accidents and injuries and working with them is definitely in your best interest. Okay, let's get into COVID. So again, this isn't a deep dive into the requirements. It's just kind of an overview and a reminder. These are the regulations for 3205, which is the emergency standard in California. 3205 applies to all employers. If you are an employer, you have to have a written program in place to address COVID prevention, and it has to meet certain standards. 3205.1 applies if you've had multiple infections or an outbreak has occurred at your facility. And an outbreak is defined as 3 lab-confirmed positive cases among employees who live in different households within a 14-day period. 3205.2 is a major outbreak. So it only applies if you've had 20 or more infections in the workplace within a 24-hour period. And then the last 2 only apply if your company provides either housing or transportation for employees. So depending on what, whether or not you provide housing or transportation, you can ignore those or you would need to apply them. In between August 25th and March 24th, Cal OSHA cited 182 companies for not having any COVID-19 prevention practices in place. And those citations typically fell under the IAPP before February, but they now fall under the COVID regulation. Your program needs to follow the regulation, including embedding HR policies regarding employee pay when they're quarantined. So to be effective, you have to have conducted an assessment of your workplace. It's the very first thing you need to do. Identify any area where your employees congregate, like a break room, or where they come into contact with others. A contact is identified as any person who spent 15 minutes or more with a case over a 24-hour window. So what that means is if you have a case, somebody who's positive, and they interacted with one of your employees for 15 minutes or more in the course of 24 hours, that person now has to be notified that they might have potentially been exposed to COVID, and you have to track all of those. So the program needs to show what controls you've implemented to prevent contact or to limit it, and you should base all those controls based on the hierarchy of controls, which we're going to talk about here. Applying the hierarchy of controls to COVID-19 exposures, we really started that with an attempt to eliminate or substitute working altogether, right? We stopped working for at least a few weeks. And then some people stayed at home and kind of worked from home. That's that substitution, right? They're working in different places there. Some companies have continued to allow that, but not everybody is able to do so. So now we have some engineering controls put in place. So distance and shielding really apply here. You're thinking of like plexiglass shields that you see in a lot of retail establishments to separate you and create some distance between you and that cashier. Administrative controls are part of this. So trying to keep people from spending time around others, maybe limiting access to your offices, keeping your employees from congregating in break areas, training them, communicating about what they need to do, not coming to work when they're sick, cleaning and disinfecting, encouraging people to wear face coverings. Those are all administrative. And then PPE, wearing face shields or other protection just based on what you've determined is necessary in your workplace. And because every workplace is different, both in how they operate, how they interact with others, how they interact with the public, and the design of the facility itself, you really have to do that assessment to figure out what will work best for your company. COVID prevention plans, let's put it that way. These programs, like any other program, it really comes down to training. So how do you train your employees? You got to make sure that they understand the risk, they understand how to protect themselves, and they know how to protect others. They need to understand how the virus spreads. They need to know that if they're sick, they need to stay home. You need to make sure that they use their masks, wash their hands, distance as much as possible in your work environment. And then they have to be advised of any COVID-19 related benefits that they qualify for. So there is a difference between injuries arising out of employment or occurring in the course of employment. Those are the definitions used to determine a workers' comp claim, and those that have to be recorded in the OSHA 300 log. So as an example, this picture shows an employee at a hotel We're going to say she's traveling on company business and she trips and she falls in her hotel room. According to Osha, her injury is considered work-related if at the time of the injury or illness, she was engaged in work activities in the interest of the employer. So an example would be if she were traveling to and from a customer location, if she were doing some kind of job task, or if she was entertaining clients. In this case, she's in a hotel room and your insurance company is going to look at this injury as arising out of her employment because she wouldn't have been at the hotel if she wasn't on a business trip. So it'll probably be a claim, most likely. But for the OSHA 300 log, if she fell and she wasn't working, it's not work related. So there is a difference there. Okay, so let's look at it in terms of COVID. A work-related exposure with COVID-19 is one in which the employee was exposed at work or because of work, right? So it's work-related. Because the virus has a long incubation period, it's hard to determine these. It has to happen after the fact, and it can be hard to track down all the information. You should consider things like if the employee interacted with someone known to be infected, or if they worked in the same area or shared anything with an infected person. And then even if an employee calls you and says, hey, I tested positive, but it didn't happen at work and I know it didn't, you still have to complete an investigation because they still may have come into contact with other employees in the workplace who could have been exposed, and you need to address that as well. So things to consider, think time, distance, and shielding. How long was the employee exposed? Were there controls like physical distancing in place that might have made it unlikely for the illness to be work-related? Consider whether the employee had work-related contact with anyone who had signs and symptoms of COVID. And then the timeline that CDC has determined is necessary to transmit the virus is a cumulative interaction of 15 minutes over a 24-hour period. And the best practices to implement to reduce the likelihood of exposure are really limiting the time spent with others, maintaining physical distancing, and then using shielding like plexiglass. So do you have to record COVID-19 illnesses in the 300 log? Yes. If the illness is determined to be work-related and it qualifies as a recordable injury. So it resulted in death, days away from work, restricted work, job transfer, medical treatment beyond first aid, loss of consciousness, or any significant injury or illness diagnosed by a healthcare professional, then it is recordable. Does it have to be confirmed to be recordable? No. Unfortunately, testing has been difficult in certain areas, and not everyone who's been determined to have COVID has actually been able to get a test. And this is changing all the time, but for right now, if it looks like they have COVID, if they've been diagnosed with it, a positive test is not necessary to make it recordable. Okay, so here are some proposed regulations. Because of COVID, there's not a whole lot of new regulations coming up. There is a public hearing next month to discuss consolidating construction safety orders for cranes and derricks into the general industry safety orders for cranes and other hoisting equipment. There was a hearing last month on firefighters' protective clothing and equipment, and it looks like there's something in the work for diving operations that's kind of on hold there, but not a whole lot coming up. And if you look at Cal OSHA's What's New page, you can see they're heavily focused on COVID-19 and violations. There is a reminder there that you need to have your OSHA 300A form posted in the workplace. You're supposed to have it up from February 1st through April 30th, so it's actually almost time for us to take those down. Okay, I think this might be our last poll question.
I think we might have one after this, but I will not
Okay.
one. Some of the employees who work for my company are outside for part or all of their workday. This is either yes or no. So Erica, you've been talking a lot. I'm sure it's nice to have just this little break right here. But we will get these respondents going. We've got about 50%. We're going to wait just a few seconds, make sure that we have good participation here and that we're keeping your attention. And Erica, we have 76% say yes and 24% say no.
Okay, so a lot of people with employees that are working outside. And the reason why we're bringing this up is because of the California Wild Protection requirements regarding smoke and air quality. So these requirements kind of started out as a emergency standard. But now employers are required under the standard to protect employees using engineering controls. Like if they work in an office, you could have a filtered ventilation system, for example, to make sure the air quality stays within healthy levels. You can use administrative controls, like limiting the duration or the amount of time that a worker is exposed to smoke or the air quality outside, or canceling work outside until air quality improves. You could even move them to another area where the air quality is better. Or you can provide personal protective equipment like an N95 to filter particles. OSHA has implemented different obligations depending on the health hazards posed by wildfire smoke and the air quality in a given area. So smoke from wildfires contains things like chemicals, gases, and fine particles that can harm health. And the greatest hazard is from breathing in these fine particles in the air called PM 2.5. And those can reduce lung function, they can worsen asthma, they can make other existing heart and lung conditions worse and cause coughing, wheezing, or difficulty breathing. So I wanted to explain what they mean by PM 2.5. This is any particulate matter that is smaller than 2.5 micrometers in diameter. So if you look at the picture on the slide, you can see that that's smaller than the diameter of a human hair. The reason why everyone's so focused on these is because they're small enough that they can be inhaled into the lungs when other larger particulate matter actually gets trapped in the respiratory system before entering the body. So depending on what that matter is, it can go on to cause irritation or inflammation or get absorbed and cause other problems. And a particular concern right now is how these conditions interact with COVID-19 and make that even more dangerous. So what do you have to do? Employers have the responsibility now to monitor air quality where employees are working. So the amount of PM 2.5 in the air can be measured in parts per million, and OSHA has developed ratings based on the quantity of particulate matter in the air. The air quality has to be monitored by the employer, and employees have to be notified when PM 2.5 is 151 parts per million or greater. And this level is considered unhealthy. So it's the beginning of the levels where it affects a person's health. Employees have to be trained on the hazards created by inhaling wildfire smoke and the company's plan to manage this. So you might have a plan that includes modifications like enclosed structures or vehicles that they can go into and the air is filtered or changes over quickly. It might be best for them to just work in another area, like we already talked about, to limit the time that they're spending outside. And they should also have access to respiratory protection like N95s for voluntary use. NIOSH has approved certain respirators that are used to filter fine particles, and there's a list here, N95, N99, N100, and so on. Employees must be provided with respiratory protection when the local air quality is rated unhealthy, very unhealthy, or hazardous. The thing is that using respirators can actually create new hazards, like increasing the likelihood of heat stress. So employees have to have some training on heat illness prevention, and they should take frequent breaks. And then also they should know that if their respirator is difficult to breathe through or it gets dirty on the inside, it should be replaced. When the PM 2.5 exceeds 500, a respirator becomes required. And once it's required, the respiratory standard kicks in, and you have to have a formal program with medical evaluations and fit testing. Medical evaluations are when your employees fill out a form that explains whether or not they have any pre-existing conditions. It's reviewed by a doctor, and then that doctor says, yeah, they're probably okay to wear a respirator, or they might want to meet with them, or they might say, no way, you should have this person wearing a respirator because their body won't be able to stand it. And then fit testing, just making sure that their respirators fit them properly and actually prevent them from inhaling the fine particles. To determine air quality, you can actually just go to this website. It's airnow.gov. You enter the zip code or the city where your employees are working, and it'll provide you this overview. Like you can see right here, it shows you the rating. So this is an old one. It's for, let's see, it's for Salinas, California, but it's from back in September. And you can see that this one has an unhealthy rating of 155 parts per million. So you can get a little bit more information about how the air quality can affect people based on whether or not they have some kind of existing condition that might make it worse for them, and then steps to take to reduce exposure. So make sure you remember, once you hit that 151, you have to notify your employees about the air quality. All right, here we go. This is the last one, right?
This is the last one. You're absolutely right. Okay, so there are areas at my workplace that get a little warm. And we have some questions coming in. I'm happy to see that from the audience. So we will be online at the end of the presentation to answer all of your questions. So really helpful if you ask your questions during the presentation so that I know how to judge how many questions there are at the end. If you wait until the end to ask your questions and they all come flooding in at once, it's a little bit more difficult to manage that way. So please feel free to ask questions in your questions box and we will get to them at the end. And we have about 55% of the people voting. So I'm going to wait just a moment here. And all right, so 73% say yes and 27% say no.
Okay, 73% yes. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because there is this indoor heat regulation. It was signed into law, but it doesn't seem to have been formally implemented yet, but it's something to be aware of and start taking action on if you haven't already. This photo shows an example of radiant heat, but heat exists in the workplace in other ways, right? This is an extreme example, but you might have employees who work in a warehouse and they roll up the doors there and leave them open for air, but then it gets really, it gets really warm in there. Or even kitchen staff in a restaurant, they can be exposed to heat as well. It can get really hot in the kitchen. The regulation is triggered when employees are present and the temperature equals or exceeds 87 degrees, or when the heat index exceeds or equals 87 degrees. It can also be triggered at 82 degrees when employees have to wear clothing that retains heat or if they're working in those high radiant heat areas. The concepts for this are kind of the same as the outdoor heat illness prevention plan, so we're pretty well versed in what that is. But I wanted to point this out and just remind you guys that it's there and it's coming. Okay, so outdoor agricultural operations during hours of darkness. According to NIOSH, almost 15 million workers in the US work full-time on evening shifts, night shifts, rotating shifts, or some kind of employer-arranged irregular schedules. This regulation is specific to ag, and it's been in place for a little while, but it's a good reminder. Section 3441, operation of agricultural equipment, was updated back in 2019 to protect employees who work at night. And what it requires is set levels of illumination provided for workers if they're working near agricultural equipment in the dark, just for their protection. It requires that trucks, even if they're off-road vehicles only, they have to have functioning headlights and they have to be used when it's dark. So that's kind of the basic gist of that one. And I also wanted to bring up valley fever. Valley fever is caused by naturally occurring fungus that can be disturbed if you're digging or otherwise disturbing soil. And it's found throughout the southwest of the United States. The fungi get inhaled and they cause the illness. So certain industries have an increased risk of exposure because they dig or disturb soil or they just spend time outside in windy conditions. So that might include ag workers, construction workers, military, firefighters, good variety of industries. There's personal industries that can also create an exposure if you're off-roading with ATVs, or even if you're just working in your home garden, you could be exposed as well. So it's an infection in the lungs, and it's caused by inhaling the spores of the fungus, and it can then spread from your lungs into your skin, bones, your joints, your brain, and your spinal cord. And you can see on the map on the left of the United States that it is in both the US and in Mexico, and it's found in a number of states. So you've got California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, all there. You can see where it is highly endemic and then where it's suspected to be. And then in California, this map is broken down into counties and it shows where the illnesses have occurred. Those dark blue areas are counties with 10 or more cases per 100,000 people per year. It's really important that you remember valley fever isn't contagious. You just get it from inhaling those spores. But Cal OSHA did implement a requirement for employee training in 11 counties with options to extend that if they discover in other areas. 67% of all cases occur in Fresno, Kern, Kings, San Luis Obispo, Tulare, Madera, and Monterey counties. And half of all the cases come from Kern County. So the training that they want you to do explains what the illness is, how somebody can come into contact with the fungus, how to prevent illness, medical conditions that might make you more susceptible, like anything that compromises your immunity might make you more susceptible, and then common treatment and it has to stress the importance of recognizing symptoms, reporting the illness, and then seeking your medical treatment. There is no vaccine to prevent this illness, so really awareness is the most important thing. Valley fever can be diagnosed through blood tests that identify antibodies, through chest x-rays, CT scans, body fluid cultures. There's antifungal medication that they can prescribe, and some people only have mild symptoms and they recover in a couple of weeks or in a few months. Okay, so before we finish up and close everything off, I wanted to stress a couple of things about your own safety programs based on what we've already talked about. So it's important to remember that your written programs are your law. They're the standard that OSHA is going to hold you to in an inspection. OSHA has different types of regulations. They're performance-based or specification-based. Fall protection requirements are specification-based because they tell you when you need to use fall protection and what is acceptable for compliance. But your IAPP, that backbone of your safety program, that one's performance-based because you decide how often you're going to do inspections, how often you're going to do training based on your own exposures. If you don't follow what you've stated in those programs, OSHA will hold you accountable. So it's important that you know what's in them and you know if you're following them. So a couple of things that you could do to address safety in your workplace and evaluate programs and practices that you already have in place. Check your safety programs and make sure your actual practices are captured and you meet the standards that you set in those programs. Do some facility inspections and correct hazards as outlined. Make sure that you're correcting the hazards as outlined in your program. And then do a job hazard analysis for key jobs. See what the hazards are and then double check yourself by looking at the training records and make sure the workers who do those jobs are properly trained on those hazards. And you can also improve safety culture and practices by joining industry associations, conducting safety leadership classes, and implementing coaching and mentoring programs. So the next couple of slides have the links that I mentioned before, and we're going to send that out to everybody. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to learn more about OSHA's upcoming regulations and ways to improve safety within the organization. This first page is updated publications from OSHA. You can see it's heavily focused on COVID-19. And then this next one are helpful links beyond OSHA. So from Bureau of Labor Statistics, Fed OSHA, State of Washington, State of Oregon, all great resources. And I'm going to stop here. So there are some questions.
Yes, we do have some questions, and that was a great presentation, Erica. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go kind of back from the start. So can employees use cell phones for hands-free navigation?
You're talking about looking at the maps to get directions as they go. It's whether or not it creates a distraction.
Hands-free navigation might refer to you put your navigation ahead of time and then your phone tells you what your route is.
Yeah. I don't think that's comparable to cell phones, like when you're talking to somebody and they tell you something that completely distracts you from driving. That's still having you focus. It can be a distraction, but probably not as much of a distraction. I don't know that there's been any research specifically that I can give you on that, but that would kind of be how I would differentiate it.
Okay. If we are a staffing company and all our employees work at client sites, and that could be whether you're a staffing company or not, there's a lot of types of industries that actually do work at client sites. How do we implement a COVID policy? And should our employees be following our client's COVID prevention policy instead of our COVID policy?
So for COVID, if they're working at a client location, they should follow whichever one is stricter. So if your client has a more strict requirement, then go ahead and follow that. If yours is more strict, then they should really meet your standards because you've already thought out the best way to protect them.
Okay. Are independent contractors paid if they get exposed to COVID-19?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit there. I think you're asking me about pay.
Yeah, are independent contractors paid if they get exposed to COVID-19?
That is an excellent question. And I'm going to refer that one to Kathy, who's our resident expert, and we'll get back on that one. Do you have the information for the person who sent you that?
Yes, I will send that later to you by email.
Okay.
So one of our participants has read that Michigan and Oregon OSHA are considering making their mask and COVID restrictions permanent for the workplace. Are you aware of any potential workplace problems that might arise if some states make mask wearing permanent?
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat the last part. Am I aware of any problems that might arise if some states make mask wearing permanent? Is that the question?
Right, that's exactly it.
Yeah, that's a tough question. You know, the COVID standards that we have in place are based on the current situation, and the current situation just keeps changing. So it's really hard to say down the line what is going to be necessary, right? Hopefully, as vaccinations come out and we get better control over this thing, then we can reevaluate what we need in the workplace and address it going forward. So I'm hoping that we get good control over this and we can move forward. I think everybody would love to stop wearing their masks, but every state is going to decide to do what's best for them. But the situation does seem to be changing. So hopefully it's improving and it stays that way.
Part of the problem is that the situation changes moment by moment.
It does. And that's why the regulations have kind of changed as we've gone on, and the requirements have changed as we've gone on. And part of that is about learning the science and figuring out what's actually happening and then applying it to the real world. And then it's also about behaviors and how people are acting and if they're doing the right things to protect themselves and others. So that's kind of where we are.
So in part of your presentation, you talked about air quality. So how does an employer test the air?
So you're not, for this one, we're talking about air quality specific to smoke caused by wildfire. So the employer doesn't have to test the air. They should actually just go to that website and use that. OSHA just wants you to verify it. So that's one way that they offer for you to verify it. And if you read the regulations, they have some other options. But airnow.gov will actually tell you based on zip code what the air quality is in that area so that you know what the measurement is and what you need to do.
Okay, and you talked about the heat index. Do you know the low end of the scale as well for the cold, where the danger starts there?
Cold requirements, I do not, and this is California specific. I'm not sure that there's a specific standard that states that, right, but I can look.
Right, and that's the interesting thing about all of these regulations is that they are state specific. And so one of our attendees wanted you real quickly to go over the COVID cases and when it's recordable. Can you repeat that?
The recordable? Sure.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find that slide because I think it outlines it. It's essentially if it's determined to be work related. Okay. So is it determined to be work related? And this is very difficult because you're trying to figure out if there was some kind of an interaction that might have led somebody to be exposed to COVID and that's now led to them being sick. There's a long incubation period, right? So 3 to 14 days is what we have in the slide. So you're usually not finding out until afterwards. So right here it says, if there is not a known exposure that would trigger the presumption of work relatedness, you have to evaluate their work duties and the environment. And that's what the next slide is really covering, is considering time, distance, and shielding and what controls are in place. You're looking for that 15 minutes cumulative over a 24-hour period. If you have some physical distancing, other controls in place that make it unlikely that they're exposed, that can help. But it's really hard to determine. And if you can't determine it, the assumption is that it is work related, is my understanding. Okay. And then gets into reporting.
Got it. Do all of these guidelines apply to 1099 contractors or volunteers or unpaid interns who might work in your company?
Okay, I'm so sorry. You're breaking up. I think you're asking if the COVID requirements apply to everybody?
No,
even if they're interns?
do all of these guidelines that we're discussing today, do they all apply to contractors, 1099 contractors, volunteers, and unpaid interns that might work in your company?
Everything that we've covered.
Yes.
If you have contractors who enter your place of work, you have to advise them of what the exposures are in the workplace, right? So they would be incorporated. And I would imagine the same thing for volunteers, right? Any kind of protections that you have in place for your employees, you want to apply that to everybody else. With COVID, you have to, again, monitor if they come in and they're sick and they make somebody else sick, or if they're exposed to somebody who's sick, then they become a contact and you have to notify them.
Okay.
Hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. Are small companies that are mostly clerical or maybe medical clinics that have less than 25 employees exempt from filling out the OSHA 300 form?
The OSHA 300 form does have a number that it's based on, there are exempt industries. There's a list of exempt industry. If you have more than, I think it's 250, then you have to file it electronically. If you have less than 25, I am not sure if that's a requirement. Again, let's check on that one.
Okay, I think it might be 20, but we can check on that. In what situations would it be best to test air quality besides wildfires?
I don't think it's a bad idea to monitor air quality kind of as a rule, but the wildfire standard is really specific because of the fires that we've had, especially in Northern California, but we have them all over, and how impactful it was for people who were working outside, and then making sure that those people are protected and that they are aware of the hazards that they're being exposed to.
Okay, and I apologize that it sounds like I might have a poor quality of internet connection. Maybe I'm not sure why I could be breaking up. I think we're getting some frustration there. I'm sorry for that. So we are going to close the webinar. Thank you for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with the instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. And thank you, Erica Baird, for your time and expertise today. We hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. And be sure to join us on May 11th for active shooter armed assailants response training for the DHS Run, Hide, Fight protocol. Thank you, everyone, and have a very safe day.